Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Hassan Sultan. I'm the CTO here at Cedar. Thank you for joining us for the second installment of our new Cedar Tech Bytes event series. Cedar Tech Bytes focuses on technical topics that we hope provide helpful insight to the engineering community. Earlier this year, we hosted Bill Magnuson of Braze, an old friend of mine, and today I'm excited to present to you our recent breakout session at TechCrunch Disrupt 2021. During the event, Cedar co-founder Arel, Lidow, and I were joined by A16Z's Julie Yoo to discuss how we inherited our broken healthcare system and how it came about, and how Cedar is building a complete consumer-first digital platform aimed at revolutionizing the financial experience for the entire healthcare industry. But because we were only able to interact with a limited audience, we wanted another opportunity to share our point of view and go a bit further in depth, which is why we're here today. Today's virtual event will conclude in about 75 minutes, and as a reminder to those who haven't joined one of our previous events, please use the chat function in the stage tab to post questions or comments. I'll be interacting after the breakout to answer questions live, so please chime in. I hope this session piques your interest in something in healthcare or engineering that you would maybe not thought much about in the past, or makes you think about these topics in a different way. But even with all the discussion we had around history, technology, investment trends, engineering approaches, and more, we really only barely scratched the surface. So please ask me any questions you might have around these incredibly complex topics. And if you run short on time, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I would be happy to answer additional questions you may have. Thank you again for joining us today. And without further ado, I present Hacking US Healthcare, how a simple platform can help solve some of America's most complex healthcare problems.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Arel, Lidow, co-founder here at Cedar, and I want to thank you for joining our breakout session today. Today, I'm going to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, which is how to fix the US healthcare system. I admit that this is a big topic, but on the surface probably sounds boring to problems like, say, self-driving cars, was actually absolutely fascinating under the hood. I promise it's well worth your time to learn about how the system actually works and what we can do to fix it. And by the end of this presentation, you're going to know more about what actually goes on in the guts of the US healthcare system than just about anyone else. It's also worth noting that collectively, we spend about 17% of US GDP on healthcare, with plenty of low-hanging fruit opportunities to improve the efficiency of the system. So whether you're a technologist or founder, or just someone who cares about solving a massive problem for society, I promise that this presentation will be well worth it. And as a bonus at the end, we're going to be sitting down with Julie Yoo from A16Z to hear about what Andreessen Horowitz thinks of the healthcare technology space and some of the ideas that they're interested in funding. But first, I just want to say a few words about Cedar. We're a healthcare fintech platform founded in 2016. We're focused on fixing the frankly very messed up healthcare financial experience for consumers in the US healthcare system. And every year, tens of millions of people interact with our platform. We're truly in a position to make a massive change and impact on the US healthcare system. And we've been incredibly fortunate to be backed by some of the best investors in the space, including A16Z, Founders Fund, Thrive Capital, and Tiger Global. And just as a shameless plug, we are hiring. So if you're interested, in joining us on our mission, we'd absolutely love to speak with you. Okay, back to US healthcare. So how the heck did US healthcare get to where it is today? I think everyone pretty much agrees that US healthcare system has a lot of very serious problems. As a country, the US spends about twice as much on healthcare versus other developed countries, yet the clinical results are no better than other countries and other developed countries. And perhaps equally important, the actual experience of patients within the US healthcare system, particularly dealing with the administrative aspect of healthcare, is extremely poor, pretty far from what we would expect as modern consumers. In fact, US healthcare is probably the only industry with dedicated subreddits where people just talk and dish about how messed of an experience they've had. People tweet things like the system is a garbage fire. They say pretty routinely terrible things about their experience. So why is U.S. healthcare so different, and how did we end up where we are? Well, it actually all started with World War II, believe it or not. During the war, the US government had to print a lot of money to fund the war effort. The US government was very concerned that all this money printing would cause prices to spiral out of control. So in 1942, President Roosevelt established the Office of Economic Stabilization to control prices. And one of the things that they did was that they instituted a wage freeze. They basically mandated that businesses could not pay their workers any more than they were already paying them. And all this was happening at a time where businesses were desperate to attract more workers into the workforce. So the businesses did a very clever thing. They basically found ways to pay their employees more without actually having to raise their wages. And one of the things that they did was that they agreed to pay for their employees' healthcare costs. And this was an extremely important event in shaping the US healthcare system as it exists today, because this really set the precedent that employers would cover healthcare costs as a benefit to their employees. And to this day, the US is really the only large developed country where most people receive their health insurance through their employer, and where employers cover most of their healthcare costs in a very direct way. So this system of where employers cover healthcare costs meant that the US healthcare system evolved very differently than other countries. In particular, we evolved to be a much more decentralized, distributed system versus other countries that evolved a much more centralized healthcare system. And as those of you who are technologists in the audience know, decentralization has some really great benefits to it, but also comes with some key costs, particularly around the efficiency of the system. So at Cedar, we actually take the unique viewpoint that most of these problems can be resolved through technology. We can actually make the whole system significantly more efficient if we were to apply technology in smart ways to fix US healthcare. But US healthcare as an industry has been particularly slow to adopt new technology. So in fact, if you think back to 2005, when Steve Jobs made his famous keynote and introduced the iPhone, which is essentially a supercomputer in your pocket, most hospitals and doctors were still using paper and faxes to run their business at the time. It really wasn't until the Affordable Care Act in 2008, which introduced massive subsidies for healthcare providers to adopt technology, that we actually saw adoption of modern technology and the usage of software in a modern sense within US healthcare. So the adoption of technology has actually been relatively recent in US healthcare. And that's an important distinction that I think is very important to put in context. So in 2008, there are really two foundational technologies that were widely adopted within US healthcare. I think that they're incredibly important to understand because they're really at the foundation and heart of how healthcare functions today. So the first advancement was electronic health records. And if we could maybe just go to the next slide here. Yep. So to explain what an electronic health record is, very simply, when you used to go to the doctor would generally keep a record of your treatment and clinical history, and they would write it all down on paper. And it really wasn't until the mid-2000s that hospitals and doctors started to transition to actually recording this information in software, to actually recording clinical notes and taking measurements and putting that into a computer system. And many hospitals actually, surprisingly, are still in this transition today. So they're still adopting health record systems or just wrapping up that transition to electronic health records today. The second really big foundational shift was the adoption of electronic claims clearinghouses. Now, this is a little bit of a mouthful, but in very simple terms, when you go to the doctor has to bill your insurance company based on what procedures they actually performed. And it used to be that doctors would fill out a form after they performed care describing what they did, and they would fax or mail that form into the insurance companies, and generally wait a month or two, and the insurance company would send them back a check in the mail saying, here's how much we'll pay for this procedure. Well, a claims clearinghouse is essentially an API to perform this thing. So a doctor can now electronically submit these forms and get a response back once insurance has determined how much they're willing to pay. This may sound like a very basic innovation. After all, APIs and electronic form submission has been around for a long, long time. But this was actually a really big breakthrough, in my opinion, in healthcare, because it was the first time where in this distributed system of healthcare, entities began speaking with one another programmatically. And you began to see the adoption of APIs within the space. Okay, so given the adoption of electronic health records and claims clearinghouses, has this actually fixed the problem? Unfortunately, it hasn't. In fact, many argue that it's actually made the problem worse, that healthcare in the US is more complex and less efficient than it's ever been. So why is this the case? I think it really boils down to three key things, which hopefully we're going to talk about more. So first is that although we've adopted technology within the US healthcare ecosystem, most of the data floating around in these systems is still unstructured. So it tends to be clinical notes that a doctor has taken, images, things like that, that have yet to actually be transferred into structured form. And where information exists in more structured forms, there are often subtle differences between different doctors or healthcare providers. The second is that although different entities in the healthcare system are now speaking with each other programmatically and working together, as complexity has increased, the ability to pass this information around in useful ways really hasn't evolved. So we're still stuck doing the most basic things when we need to be sharing much more complex information across the system. Then last but not least, and most important to the problem that we're solving at Cedar, the evolution of technology in the healthcare system has actually resulted in a less personalized experience for patients. It used to be that the doctor providing care for patient was very deeply involved in the actual administrative experience and how much you should be billed as a patient and the communication to you. Now, the actual administrators and systems that determine, for instance, how much you should be billed and what your insurance will cover are many more steps removed from the actual patient. And this results in consistently terrible experiences for patients. So how do we fix all this? Well, at Cedar, we think that there are two major opportunities in generally speaking, to improve the system. So the good news is that for the very first time, the US healthcare system is now in a position where doctors and hospitals are now widely using just basic technology that we can build upon. And there's a huge opportunity to build new applications on top of this. We're already seeing this, but there's ever more increasing complexity with things like devices that need to connect to the system. But I think that the two big opportunities to improve the system are first, building around the system as it exists today. So what we've realized at Cedar is that it's extremely difficult to replace the foundational components of the system. For instance, the electronic health records or the clearinghouses. That infrastructure is likely here to stay. But it is possible to build around or sort of hack around what already exists in place. So for instance, one of the things that we try and do at Cedar is to abstract a lot of the complexity and provide a simple interface for patients to deal with to navigate the financial side of their care. The second big opportunity that we see is to use machine learning and artificial intelligence to make use of the unstructured information that's floating around everywhere. And there are incredible number of use cases for things like natural language processing. At Cedar, for instance, we're using natural language processing and machine learning to understand clinical health records to make the prior authorization process a huge source of inefficiency, an order of magnitude more efficient. So we see, a new horizon of technology adoption within the U.S. healthcare ecosystem. We're incredibly excited about the doors and options that this is going to unlock for everyone. If you're a founder or technologist looking to enter the space, U.S. healthcare is particularly ripe for disruption right now. We'd love to talk to you about, how you can do this if you're interested. Next, I want to introduce our panelists and shift over. We've now covered how the basic, back end of healthcare works. So I'm excited to be joined by Julie Yoo, General Partner at A16Z, as well as Hassan Sultan, CTO here at Cedar, to give a deeper dive into some of the lessons learned and other frontiers in the healthcare landscape that are ripe for innovation. We'll also leave a few minutes at the end to address any questions from the audience as well. But before we jump in, let me introduce you both to Julie and Hassan. So Julie Yoo is General Partner at Andreessen Horowitz, where she leads investment in healthcare technology with a focus on companies that are modernizing how we access, pay for, and experience the healthcare system. And prior to joining A16Z, Julie was the co-founder and chief product officer at Kairos, which was a health tech company recognized as a market leader in patient access. We're also joined by Hassan Sultan, our chief technology officer here at Cedar. His vision really informs Cedar's product roadmap and our feature functionality. He leads the engineering team here and is just a world-class technologist. So thank you both for joining us today. And I'd love to start off maybe with a question for Julie. So Julie, on a high level, given your experience in healthcare, I'm curious to hear, whether what we just talked about resonates with you, whether you still think that there's opportunity to build upon and improve the sort of U.S. healthcare system today.
Yeah, thanks, Arel, and great to be here with both of you. Certainly as someone who, I would liken the last 15 years of my career to banging my head against the concrete wall of the legacy healthcare system, similarly trying to improve the patient experience. So, to answer your tactical question, yes, this absolutely resonates. And, I think a lot of what Cedar has been doing for payments, my company Kairos was doing the same for scheduling, back in 2010 when we founded it. And scheduling is certainly yet another example of one of those areas of healthcare that is equally archaic, opaque, frustrating for all parties involved. So there's a ton of analogies, with my experience with regards to what you were describing. And maybe I'll just add, and I think there were some audio issues at the beginning, so maybe I'll just sort of recast some of what you had described in your slides that I think are worth highlighting with regards to context on thinking about opportunity in this space. So one, I do genuinely believe that we are at a sort of a phase shift, moment in time where, the first generation of health tech products that were out there, let's call it, 2010 to 2018 or so era, were really basically about, how do we just replace the fax and, simply taking sort of manual processes and turning them into digital. And I think increasingly what we're seeing now, which is so exciting, is the opportunity for health tech companies to really fundamentally rewire the processes from the ground up, and open up net new capabilities and kind of increase the surface area of care models in ways that weren't possible before, largely driven by changes in things like payment models that are creating new incentive structures that drive new behaviors. So, I agree with much of what you said there with regards to kind of what has been frustrating about the progress or lack thereof that we've made in the past, but, why is now sort of a different and unique moment. And then the second thing that I'll re-highlight from what you said is, this is one of those industries where the government can be a friend. There can be major tailwinds for category creation in healthcare that are entirely driven by government mandates. So, you mentioned interoperability, transparency, even value-based care. All of these policies and rules and mandates are really creating urgency to adopt, modern technologies in ways that hadn't been there before. The check in the box capability in and of themselves are very quickly becoming table stakes and commodities. So it's not that a company can necessarily solely rely on those products as durable strategies long term, but I do believe that they are interesting and effective wedges in terms of market entry. And then the last thing I'll say, which is again a reinforcement of something that you said, was yes, healthcare has been slow to adopt technology. However, the stakes are just high, right, in this market. The front lines of healthcare have always been a very high volume, very high stress, place, and that only increased, of course, over the last couple of years with the pandemic. And so the notion of taking someone's already stressful environment, inserting something net new, even if it's better, asking them to change, right, and learn something new, that burden and the change could also in most cases have a very direct impact on the patient and kind of the care plan and how their journey progresses or not. And so inherently this the bar for how you introduce technologies into this domain is inherently higher than in other industries because of that sort of patient care and high stakes dynamic. So those would just be a few things I would highlight from what you described earlier.
Great. And Hassan, we talked a lot about the evolution of technology in healthcare and how for the first time, like even basic technology has been adopted at scale by doctors and hospitals. But it's still this kind of giant tangled mess. We have a lot of unstructured data. Systems don't speak to each other particularly well. So given the sort of tangled mess, Hassan, in your opinion, what do you think is the right way to fix it? And more specifically, what do you view as the biggest challenges in terms of incorporating modern technology and building around the problems of legacy systems and healthcare?
Yeah, well, first of all, as an engineer, any system I didn't build myself feels like a legacy system to me. And I had to overcome that bias first to really try to understand these systems. But really, I think jokes aside, there are three key things to remember when you're engaging with the healthcare system from a technical perspective. First is you've got to build on what exists. The second is integrations, and the third is canonicalization. And let me just walk through each of those. What exists in healthcare today, as you already talked about earlier, were electronic health record systems, for example. These are systems that basically run the providers day to day. They manage their data, they help manage their operations. They're meant to solve complex enterprise problems, which they do solve, but they're not meant to solve patient problems, which they therefore do not solve very well. And so we have to work within that because the provider is not going to change the system. It does solve their problem. To solve the patient problem, we have to build around it. So that's the first piece. I think you've mentioned this as well, which directly leads to the second piece, which is integrating with these systems, however, can be a big challenge. We have a number of standards in the space, but like you mentioned earlier, but maybe people didn't hear it because the sound was off. They're incomplete, they're unstructured. They don't have the kind of data that you need sometimes to answer the questions from a patient perspective. For example, why did insurance pay this bill but not that bill? And extracting that data is a really big challenge. And it's one of the big things we have to deal with at Cedar. And then lastly, even if you do all of that well, you build around the system, you build this great integration, there's a lot of complexity in that system. And you have to be very careful to not let that complexity bleed into your own product, because then it'll bleed into the patient experience, which needs to be very simple. The patient doesn't actually care that there are denial codes being used to exchange information between providers and payers. They just want to know, oh, my insurance was expired. The information they have is old. And to do that, we have to really build this kind of interface between our core integration platform and our core product that presents a canonicalized data interface. So those are the three things from my perspective, but that's all obviously a lot easier said than done.
Yeah, it's certainly a difficult problem. Maybe back to you, Julie. Like, I'd be interested to know, which companies do you think are doing a particularly good job sort of building around the sort of mess of healthcare technology? And, what do you think, what do you see as sort of particularly effective techniques that they're using?
Yeah, maybe kind of answering the latter part of that question first, and then sharing some examples. So I think you could largely think of maybe like two different ways to deal with the mess. So, one thing you could do is just insert yourself into the mess, take a slice of that mess and, use technology to automate it, streamline it, make it, far more efficient, and then expand into other slices over time, and kind of expand the surface area that way. And that tends to be, more of kind of a margin-oriented play where you can say, I'm going to do something that already is being done today, but do it at a 10x better margin, and that's how I'm going to get growth and credit for, for my value add. So, I would actually, I think a lot of what Cedar does falls into this bucket where, patients pay bills today, but the way that you do it is completely archaic, broken, asynchronous, and non-transparent. And so how do you then, just carve that out, literally say, health system, give me that part of your business and I will take care of, all the abstraction, making that patient experience delightful, and then also wiring in effectively to the back end components that I need to, just fix that from the bottoms up. So I think that's one approach. Another approach would be that you can actually create a, fully vertically integrated offering that builds outside the mess and actually, kind of goes after potentially large markets. So markets that might not exist today, but have the potential to be, big because the people in those markets are so underserved by the current mess. Maybe eventually, as you've alluded to, you have to integrate with that mess to acquire new users or, just clean it up to make your business better. But essentially, it's more of a market share type play where, again, you're creating net new white space that might not exist today. So, I think a lot about companies in kind of the primary care space that fall into this bucket. We wrote a piece last year around the unbundling of primary care and how today, primary care is really kind of a blunt instrument that has to be everything to everyone. But if you were to just carve out, specific populations of individuals who are severely underserved by the market today, whether it's, millennials or LGBTQ populations. So there's, a company called Folks that I think is a great example of this, where, their care model is entirely designed around the needs of the LGBTQ community, and therefore they are able to, not be beholden to, all of the sort of least common denominator type approaches that you see in some of these broader care models, while also, kind of tailoring the marketing and just the overall, messaging and experience to things that resonate with that audience. But, the services that they provide are still standard clinical services that can get reimbursed under the existing reimbursement rails. So I think there's lots of great examples like that are sort of vertical plays. Maybe another example in that bucket that's slightly different is, companies like TruePill, which enable providers to offer services that they were never able to deliver before, which, both expands, kind of the revenue mix that these providers can deliver, while also changing the game, right, in many ways about, what constitutes a minimal viable solution that you bring to a market. I think they're doing sort of a very interesting job of kind of raising the bar on the mix of services that a viable, virtual care company would need to have coming out of the gate, versus what historically has been, a very high barrier to entry. So I think those are a couple of frameworks and examples of ways by which I think companies are effectively either, throwing themselves into the mess or navigating around the mess to create that new market opportunity.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially the packaging of both kind of technology solutions with new payment models or care models as well. That's particularly interesting. Maybe zooming out for a minute. Julie, when we were sort of prepping before this session, you mentioned that all the things that you wanted to see happen in the last 15 years are finally coming true. It's this like new dawn of opportunities that are opening up. So when it comes to healthcare investing in general, what are the ideas that you would love to fund at A16Z, and generally, what are the big priorities in the health tech space for A16Z?
Yeah, I think you had asked me to limit this to like 2 or 3, so that's hard to do. But I'll highlight a couple of key items on my wish list. So one general category that we're very excited about is the new infrastructure layer for virtual first value-based care. Almost kind of likening it to a new operating system layer for how value-based models that have patient in the center and are not predicated on just sporadic in-person encounters are being served by, again, new tech companies that are kind of powering this whole industry. And we've written about this before, this notion that when you look at, now the explosion of digital health companies that are all providing direct, patient care, many of them, are either looking at the market and saying, gosh, there's all these legacy IT solutions out there that we could use for our back office and clinical operations and whatnot. But, those systems were entirely optimized for, a time when fee for service was the majority business model, when literally patients were not even considered an end user, like the EHR systems that you referred to earlier. Patient portal was kind of a bolt-on, thing that was a very after the fact product capability. Whereas again, these digital health companies are obviously putting patients first and really, they are direct users of these systems that are being delivered. And so, the whole swath of companies that are getting started to, create these new components of what a digital health company needs to get up and running, almost like the AWS or the Plaid or the Stripe, whatever analogy you want to use. I think that whole space is extremely exciting to us. And, we've made a few bets there, and there's lots of exciting companies out there already, but I think there's a ton of white space to really get at filling the holes that, the legacy EHRs are not able to fill. So that would be sort of, one item, big category, but, one item on my list. A second thing I like to think a lot about is kind of, how do you upend the plight of the 3-letter acronyms in healthcare? So there's a lot of 3-letter acronyms like PBMs, GPOs, CROs that, sit at a very strategic node in the healthcare system, generally kind of a middleman type orientation, but, massive amounts of payments, of product, of just transactions are flowing through these nodes. And historically, they've been extremely intractable areas for startups to try to disrupt because of the scale, dynamics, and just the oligopolies and lots of entrenched interests around these existing models. So I think companies that are not necessarily saying out of the gate, like, I'm going to be a PBM and go directly after the belly of the beast, but, using the patient relationship as a means to kind of back into many of the capabilities and functionalities that these players serve. And, kind of, again, classic disruption theory, kind of tearing off, kind of the end components of what those systems do, and over time getting scale to eat into that would be another sort of big category where I'm excited to see some modern takes.
Yeah, cool. And Hassan, maybe back to you, like talking a little bit more just about the data aspect of all this, and kind of the tangled mess that is healthcare technology today. Can you talk specifically about some of the choices we've had to make at Cedar in terms of infrastructure and development approach, and team structure, as we've scaled up to try and tackle some of these problems?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think really there are like 3 high-level things that have been pretty important. One, it will sound very non-technical, but it's keeping the mission focus first, specifically on the patient. But it does show up in the data, like I was talking about earlier, where you can just pull a limited amount of data and still present a bill that's meaningless to a patient, or you can pull a lot of data that's much harder to do, but present a much more meaningful sort of answer to a patient's actual question. And so that's one big part of our whole culture, I would say. The next, I think, is kind of a common thing in consumer businesses, but not so much in at least healthcare enterprises and maybe even enterprises generally speaking, which is to be structured where you have things like user experience and design and data science embedded within your product and engineering teams as peers, so they can really help you define world-class, delightful patient experiences and get away from sort of just check the box user interface, which is very, very common in healthcare. And I guess the last thing is back to that core integration challenge we talked about before. You can do that in a number of ways, but a classic ETL approach, I think, is less good than an ELT approach for a variety of reasons in this space. Specifically, the ELT approach allows you to more easily debug issues and also shield yourself from things where even if you have an automated data pipeline, a lot of the raw sources of data are still humans doing form entry at a hospital or patients filling out a form. And so there's just human error there. And ELT just helps you sort of build data quality and processes around that that are, I think, very important. I know that sounds simple, but all computer science problems are reducible to ETL problems. So there's a lot under there.
Right. Everything that seems simple is actually really a very complex problem under the surface. Maybe, back to you, Julie, just zooming out and talking about the data interoperability problems. I talked a little bit during my presentation about how, really the financial data is like the most, I think, the best example of how data has become interoperable in healthcare through clearinghouses. But I'm curious to get your take of, why hasn't there been more development of interoperability of data, of things like health records for patients within the U.S. healthcare system?
Yeah, it's a profound question, and I wish there was a simple answer that we could just kind of point the bullet at. But I would say a couple of things. So one is, I think interoperability, I think traditionally is talked about in the context of medical records, so EHR data. But actually interoperability means a lot of different things, right? To your point, there's actually a fintech opportunity in healthcare, which is really around claims data and EDI transactions, as you described. The clearinghouse concept earlier, which you generously called an API, but I would argue it's far from a real sort of modern web services oriented API today. It's really kind of these legacy EDI systems. And then even like my company was building. I assumed actually when I started my company that scheduling APIs existed, and lo and behold, they certainly didn't. And so we spent, a great number of years and time and money actually having to build, much of that infrastructure from scratch. So I think just the, definition of interoperability in and of itself is quite massive. And, I think we're making sort of headway in specific categories of that. So I do think, for instance, EHR data, the traditional medical record data, we have seen quite a bit of advancement, I would say, with regards to the liquidity of said data assets over the last decade or so. And that has been largely driven, and again, also the answer to your question about why hasn't this happened before, I think a lot of that is just incentives based, right? What incentive did we have in the fee-for-service universe to, not just do another procedure to generate a net new data set, but rather ask someone else for their record and not get to bill for that service in my own practice. So I think with the shift towards value, again, sort of still early days in that regard, but when you look at companies like Oak Street or any of these risk-bearing providers, they are expressly making heavy investments into both inward interoperability of data as well as outward, because the business model literally relies on it, on an accurate picture of how their patients are doing so that they can accurately underwrite the risk. So I do think that that's moving along. That's one curve that you kind of see slowly but surely creeping in the upward to the right direction. I think there's another really interesting second curve, which is now your average digital health company is generating like multiple orders of magnitude bigger sets of data about a given patient than any traditional provider, right? some of our portfolio companies like Firefly and Omada, like they have dozens of touch points with every single patient every single month. And so what's been interesting is to watch those companies actually literally have to hack like the FHIR standard, FHIR standard, which is a data standard for both storage and transmission of data. Like they've had to hack that standard to make their data work for those protocols. And a simple example of that is something like an encounter, right? Like an encounter is kind of a core data entity in the traditional data schemas, but what is an encounter when you're doing asynchronous text messaging with your patient, every single day? So I think that's another curve that we're starting to see emerge is, a completely fundamentally different definition of interoperability for digital health companies that are creating these continuous data trails that are, multimodal, highly, comprehensive, have, very different data elements, some of which are not even clinical data, right? You hear a lot about these sort of social needs and, diet and food and transportation and home, do you actually have, kind of a sustainable environment that you're living in, which, could have negative impacts on your health. Like all of that data is now being collected as part of these novel care models that are going to require fundamentally, upending the traditional ways that we've stored and transmitted this data. So, right when we're starting to get to sort of the tipping point, I think of almost solving the legacy data problems, we're sort of, creating new problems, which is exciting from a startup and, kind of innovation opportunity perspective, that will require fundamentally different approaches.
Got it. And maybe just as a follow-up to that, one of the big problems that we see within the system is that data tends to be very unstructured in healthcare. Like there's still an enormous amount of free-form text and data that's sort of semi-structured, but can be interpreted in very different ways. Julie, I'm curious what you see in terms of companies using machine learning or artificial intelligence to try and better understand this data and make use of it.
Yeah, I think there's so we're big investors in companies that are using AI. I would say across multiple areas. So one is and perhaps arguably the lowest hanging fruit area is around the administrative end of the stick of healthcare. And again, I would put Cedar in this category of saying there are some non-clinical tasks that need to be done. And today, the majority of how those tasks are performed and completed is brute force human labor. And, there's no like sort of leveraging of the wisdom of crowds in terms of learning, a specific workflow and how to optimize it, or pooling the collective knowledge across, geographically distributed teams to then say, how can we, go about doing this better, or just not have to repeat the same rote work over and over again. So I think there's, again, relatively straightforward and not saying that they're simple per se, but, kind of obvious use cases for the application of AI to do tasks that today are done, by kind of brute force human labor in far more intelligent ways to almost like redefine the workflows, from scratch, right? Like when you, throw a set of bodies at a given problem, there's a limit, there's constraints on how the human will interpret the set of steps that they could take to kind of complete that task. But when you take an AI approach, you might actually find that there are completely different paths that no human would have come up with that actually accomplish that task in a far more efficient way. So I think areas like the revenue cycle, like scheduling, et cetera, are seeing a lot of these types of applications as kind of low-hanging fruit opportunities, but massive, right? I mean, revenue cycle alone is a $400 billion market today, and so there's still a ton of headroom for depth in that domain. Then I think really perhaps what the holy grail is for our space is the application of AI in clinical practice, right? So how do you actually scale clinical judgment, through the use of AI, right? Because what is the most scarce resource in our healthcare system? It's clinician judgment. It's clinicians' brains, and that is, that was the premise of the company that I started, was this notion of the fundamental supply-demand mismatch between patient demand and available provider supply. And I think there are huge opportunities to, think about how do you take existing expertise that, today only exists in, let's say, 10 health systems in the country, and, democratize access to that to all patients who need it, but also be very smart about load balancing and, only sending patients to the high-end expertise if it's truly needed, but then taking advantage of the long tail of supply when that can appropriately fit the need. And then frankly, also tapping into, new pools of labor, right? And saying, how do we actually arm a pharmacist or an EMT or a phlebotomist with capabilities that allow them to practice at the top of their license, but today are kind of challenging because you need to train, each individual human on fairly sophisticated tasks. So, that's a second area where, I think we are at a tipping point where we now have enough scaled data, as we were just talking about, that is unstructured, that, inherently requires, more of a sophisticated AI-based approach to take advantage of, but are, also coming at a time when our system is strained with regards to the supply-demand mismatch problem. And therefore, fundamentally, there's an alignment with kind of revenue and growth opportunities that people are really willing to put their weight behind.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe Hassan, to ask you a slightly different variant of that question. We bump into problems, for instance, prior authorization, where machine learning can be used to significantly reduce the cost of some of these processes in some cases. Hassan, do you see sort of a holy grail there of using machine learning to completely replace the human-based workflows, or do you think it's a better strategy to sort of augment human workflows?
Well, this is very near and dear to my heart because the company I was co-founder of before Cedar was also basically going after this clinical space, and that was our big discovery, was that if you want to have high impact, at least in the near term, the best way is an augmentation. So building a system that essentially empowers clinicians, or even, like you said, Julie, lower skilled clinical analysts that you can train to make decisions, and then helps learn from their decisions over time to give them better options, get more accurate options. So instead of having a clinician, go through a lengthy chart and give you, a long story about treatments, just have pop up the 3 big elements of data that they would probably care about and the 3 options, and let them pick and learn from that. So I'm a big believer in the augmentation approach, and I think the same applies to prior auth probably. Although I think in the non-clinical cases, there's a better chance that you can eventually fully automate those things, I think.
Yeah. And we actually have, a few questions from the audience, and AI seems to be at the top of the list of what everyone is interested in here. But here's a particularly good question, Julie. I think this one is a good question for you. So someone's asking, whether the market, in particular, patients, will accept sort of AI-based advice or doctor, AI-based doctor assistance when trying to diagnose issues or things like that. Do you see AI potentially replacing the role of clinicians, or again, maybe to ask a similar question, do you see it more as augmenting the role of clinicians within healthcare?
Yeah, no, this is a great question, because I think I would say absolutely patients would take an automated solution hands down if that means that they would have more convenient and timely access to care. I think there's a separate question of what is the appropriate set of use cases for which that should apply. And I think the initial area where we saw a lot of uptake of AI, of quote unquote AI, is, kind of this notion of triage, where a patient might simply, I have some issue, I have, pain in my back. Do I even need to go see a doctor, or is there, some other, easier way for me to get the service that I need? And even within that doctor question, do I need to go see an orthopedic surgeon or a primary care doctor? And that has, real significant implications on the cost equation of our healthcare system. So there was a tremendous amount of promise and investment made into these upfront triage bot type modalities that would essentially right level the site of care, so to speak, and ensure that you were making the appropriate utilization of the right service, not replacing the doctor, but it's sort of upstream of the doctor. So I think that that's a very valid use case around how to utilize an AI-based technology is really to again, not diagnose and not treat, but simply triage to the right level of care and the right type of provider. I think the other part of this question is sort of what is the right insertion point for AI, and how do you kind of think about getting this into workflow? And there are either patient-facing or even provider-facing solutions. There are I would argue there's another question in here about sort of how do you package these solutions in such a way that they're actually adopted and accepted by this very conservative audience of buyers? And I think that's where there's a lot of sophisticated and perhaps even clever ways of packaging solutions in such a way that actually the API, so to speak, looks exactly like anything else, right? Like, I'm a provider, I'm going to contract with a payer just as any traditional provider will, but on the inside, I'm going to use AI to actually deliver my service. Or in the revenue cycle, I'm a managed service. I'm an
All right. I think we're back, so I'm gonna try to take some audience questions now. Let me see what we have here from people. Okay, so I guess the first question people have asked is, you spoke a fair amount of the data challenges in the healthcare space. How have these challenges evolved as Cedar has scaled? Did you bring certain assumptions to the table that needed to change over time? Yeah, so we definitely brought a lot of assumptions that needed to be fixed. And the essence of those was that these kinds of data standards and APIs and mechanisms for data interchange would be very well established, given all the media attention you hear about standards in the healthcare space. You have everything from HL7, FHIR, you have sort of EMR specific standards and APIs. All the EMRs have some sort of API. But what we discovered in practice was that the depth of data you need to answer patient questions about their bill is quite deep and is not always available from these sort of standard feeds. And also that some of the data is just not available through them at all. And so we had to find more interesting ways to get at these data. And so that was one big assumption. And then I think the other big assumption that probably was different, was interesting, was that we felt originally we thought that if you're dealing with a specific EMR, like say Epic or Cerner or Centricity, that they will be fairly standardized, at least within instances of that EMR. And we also discovered that that is definitely not the case, because they're highly configurable platforms that each sort of provider has optimized for their own workflows. And so the data actually look different depending on which kind of client instance you're looking at. So I think those were probably the two big learnings from on the data end. Please feel free to add more questions if you have any, and apologies for the glare. I should have been better prepared. Okay, so moving on to the second question. You said a classic ETL approach is inferior to an ELT approach for a variety of reasons in this space. The ELT approach allows you to more easily debug issues and shield you from human error. That's a quote, I guess, from me. And for those who may not be as aware of the nuances of these approaches, can you elaborate a little bit on why you think that? Okay, yeah, so this is a fair question. So first of all, to unpack a lot of the acronyms, the main difference between the sort of ELT approach and the ETL approach is that you store the incoming data first, and then you transform it, instead of first extracting it, then transforming it, and then saving it. So in this case, you have the raw data itself stored in a data lake or some sort of staging area. And the reason why that is so important is because essentially, given all the different complexities of the incoming data that I've just finished talking about, no matter how robust your system is, there will be edge cases that you will not be able to predict initially, that will cause your system to compute the wrong thing or be unable to process data. And so the approach of storing the raw incoming data first allows you to debug those problems much more easily, and also build sort of quarantining and data governance capabilities on top of that that can be very helpful. So hopefully that gives a little bit more color on what I meant by that, but happy to take follow-ups. Okay, so question number 3 from somebody. You talked about not letting healthcare complexity bleed into Cedar's products. How do you keep guardrails up to make sure you have a simple experience for patients and consumers? This is a great question. And I spoke a little bit about one key aspect of it earlier, which I'll quickly cover, but then I'll go into some other aspects that I think are pretty important. From a technical architecture perspective, the most key element is that our entire sort of product suite works off of a canonical data model. And our integrations are where all of this data complexity is encapsulated, and they do all the heavy lifting of transforming the incoming data into our canonical data model. So that's one sort of big architectural decision that enables us to have the patient experience be sort of more simple or as simple as possible. In addition to that, we also do a lot of work on the design and data science side to assess where there are gaps, where there are things that are getting too complex or people are not understanding them, or need to be optimized. And based on those, we iterate on our product and our designs frequently to run experiments on other ways of doing things and optimize based on those results of those experiments. So that is a sort of key capability at Cedar to really build the optimal patient experience. And it's pretty common in the consumer space, but it's much less common in healthcare. So moving on to the next question. Can you talk about how Cedar uses AI and machine learning to make use of unstructured information in healthcare? Yeah, so this is a great question. I guess, look, the first piece is that we use AI in our integrations so that we can get data in different formats and still be able to interpret it well. We also use it heavily in our engagement platform to deciding different modalities of communication, different channels with different times, even some of the content of the communication, figuring out what is most relevant to a patient or not. And then also things on a more sort of specialized space around, extracting data from your insurance card images or things like that. So those are sort of the key buckets where we use different forms of sort of AI to augment our system. Okay, so another question, can you talk about the engineering growth paths at Cedar? Yes, I can talk about them, but I can also give you a much better source than hearing me speak about them, which is our tech blog, decode.cedar.com, has a blog post called our engineering growth framework that lays out the tracks in much more detail and then links out to a spreadsheet with very detailed sort of responsibilities and expectations at different levels. And that is the same document we use internally to build development plans and to assess people's growth and things like that. But at a high level, the engineering paths are, there are two sort of big tracks. There is the sort of manager track and the IC track. And you can't really be a manager until you've gotten to a certain level of seniority on the engineering track. And it's also not a permanent choice. If any of you've read the blog post on the engineering manager pendulum, we sort of, in the early levels of engineering manager, give people the option to move back and forth between those tracks as they get to know the different jobs and how they make them feel. Within that, I think there are lots of sort of growth paths, from sort of different roles. You can have growth paths that evolve from one role to another. A good example would be our solution architects can sort of go into the engineering track and become IC engineers or managers. They can also go into our sort of product path if they're very interested in that, because there's a lot of product thinking that goes into working with our clients to figure out how to deploy our solutions. And there's even potential paths to commercial roles, more commercial facing roles. But happy to answer any more specific questions if that doesn't cover it. Otherwise, feel free to refer to the blog post. Okay, so another question is, what is the biggest data model challenge with users? What concepts do you need it to educate users on to use your application well? I'm not 100% sure that I fully understand the question, because I think if we are doing our job well, the users of our application will by and large not need to be educated. Sort of the Apple model of you don't need sort of documentation on how to use the product. It should be intuitive enough. So we try to keep the complexity on the patient-facing side fairly low, and sort of introduce the minimum amount of complexity, so we don't have to introduce people to a lot of new concepts. A good example of this is that it's easier to have you take a photo of your insurance card than to sort of ask you to read a bin number from the back of the insurance card. And that's like the kind of model that we use. But at a high level, we try to focus on the patient-centric language. So the data model behind it is less relevant than what the patient sees. So let me give a specific examples. There are a lot of codes in the healthcare industry used for everything from defining what kind of care was given, to billing that care, to communicating with insurance and back. Everything from sort of CPT codes to DRG codes to denial codes. And instead of exposing all of that to our patients, what we do is we try to figure out, given the context of the patient, automatically what is the most relevant piece of information. Is it that based on this denial code, I know that your insurance is expired? Because then I should probably just tell you that. That's what you need to hear. Or if your member ID is missing based on a denial code, that's what we should show you. So that's the sort of strategy, and it's a little bit different than just educating patients on the detailed data model. I don't know if that answers your question. Feel free to ask me any follow-ups. Can you talk about what it's like to be an engineer on the implementations team? Great question. So the implementations team is, I think, a very interesting engineering team at Cedar, because it exposes you to the kinds of problems that you might not see as often in a traditional engineering role, because it sits at the confluence of sort of all the major functions at the company, everything from sort of the commercial roles, sales, partnerships, and client growth, as well as technical roles. You have to build the integration with code, so there's an engineering element to it. You're also sitting in front of the client, so there are client-facing skills. You also have to translate the client's requests to our product, so there's some element of sort of product management type of skill. And so what it's like is you go from a client to client, implementing different client integrations, and you try to optimize our integrations platform to drive away repetitive work. You also try to give feedback to our product teams to improve the product in ways that can platformize things that you are maybe having to do on a client by client basis. And then it also gets you extremely deep into healthcare, the data models, the workflows, and also into our product very deeply. And so it's a very good learning place for anyone who's interested in healthcare, and also for earlier stage engineers, especially because you can sort of explore the different career paths that you might take, whether it's a commercial role or a product role or an engineering role, because you kind of sit in the middle of all of that. So hopefully that answers the question, but happy to take anything else. I don't know that we have any more questions. So Given that, I'm going to wrap us up for today. Thank you all for joining us and coming and asking your great questions. If you want to reach out, feel free to ping me on LinkedIn. If we get a lot of questions, we might post them on the blog. And do check out decode.cedar.com and cedar.com for our tech blog and our new events and content as they come out. Hopefully, I'll see you at future events. Thank you.